Hello, sixth graders. I planned this video for early in sixth grade. If we were to just take the textbook and go lesson by lesson beginning in late August, we may not get to this topic in the book for some months, but sometimes those topics that are later on in the book can be done earlier. Not all of them, obviously. Much of what we do in math, the way we learn math, is to build on what comes before. We can't always just jump ahead and expect to understand things. But occasionally there are topics, the way the textbooks are arranged, which is not always ideal. Sometimes topics are placed in the textbook that could have come earlier. And this is one of them because, as the very first line up there indicates, this is what I want your takeaway to be for this video, this topic. Finding a percent of a number is simply multiplying two numbers. Notice I've underlined the word of and multiplying. We've connected those. When we learned how to multiply with fractions, we started with this word of, understanding 2/3 of 9, for example. Remember that? Basic starting point for multiplying two fractions. We think of 2/3 of 9 as being 2 times 1/3 of 9. 1/3 of 9 is 3. 2/3 of 9 is 2 times 3 or 6. That's how I began. And we got to more and more complex, harder to understand situations like, what's 2/3 of 5/7? That's not obvious. But I took you through the process of realizing that in a case like that, you can just multiply across the top and bottom. We showed why that works. Why, for any two fractions, if you want to multiply them, you multiply across the top and bottom. We're going to do that here because percents are fractions. The definition, x percent is x over 100. It's a fraction in disguise. Whole numbers are fractions in disguise too. I'm looking at this whole number 400 here throughout several examples. It's a fraction. It's 400 over 1. It's 800 over 2. It's 1200 over 3. And 50%. You've all encountered that in your lives outside of math class. 50%. It's a fraction. It's 50 over 100. Whatever this number is, the percent, x percent, whether it's 50%, 100%, 1%, a half a percent. We're going to have to deal with things like that eventually. Whatever this x is, x percent is x over 100. A percent is a fraction in disguise, and the denominator is always 100 by definition. We've connected that word of with multiplication. So how are we going to approach 1% of 400? 1% is 1 over 100. Of is times. 400 is 400 over 1. Multiplying across the top and bottom, we get 400 over 100. We interpret the fraction as a division. You see how everything we learn in 5th grade is going to come up over and over. I can't even predict it because it's so important. Those basics that we learned about fractions are going to continue to be with us. We're going to be doing things without even realizing that this is something we learned in October of 5th grade or whatever. At some point, I taught you to understand this as a division. It's a fraction. It's the 400th on the number line, but it can also be thought of as 400 divided by 100. This is an improper fraction, and it simplifies to 4. You can think of this as a division. 400 divided by 100 is 4. Let's do the next one. 2% of 400 is 2 over 100 times 400 over 1. Now, you may be wondering as you look at the first couple here, could I cancel? Yes. But let's just stick with the old multiply across the top and bottom. The canceling is not that much easier in this case. It might even, in these cases, it might even make things a little bit more complex. Let's just multiply across the top and bottom now. 2 times 400 over 100 times 1. We have 800 over 100. As a division, 800 divided by 100 is 8. And let me make this point. 2% of 400 it had to be twice as big as 1% of 400. Right? This should not surprise us that 1% of 400 is 4, so 2% of 400 has to be 2 times that 4, or 8. 4% of 400. 4 over 100 times 400 over 1. 1,600 over 100. Dividing, we get 16. And of course, we can say the same thing here. 4% of 400 had to be 4 times bigger than 1% of 400. So that 16 is 4 times the 4. And 4% of 400 has to be twice as much as 2% of 400. So that 16 is twice the 8. 5% of 400. 5 over 100 times 400 over 1. That's 2,000 over 100, right? 5 times 400 is 2,000. 2,000 divided by 100 is 20. So 5% of 400 is 20. Now, you could refer back to the 1% of 400. If 1% of 400 is 4, 5% of 400 has to be 5 times bigger than the 4, which is 20. It all fits together. 10% of 400. 10 over 100 times 400 over 1 equals, multiplying across the top bottom, 4,000 over 100. 4,000 divided by 100 is 40. What is the number you multiply 100 by to get 4,000? It's 40. And of course, 10% of 400 had to be twice as much as 5% of 400. So that 40 is twice the 20. If you're thinking there are other ways that we could have done these problems, very good. You're absolutely right. This is not going to be the only video on finding a percent of a number. It's easy. So I don't want you to think that just because there's going to be a second video, maybe a third, I don't want you to think that's because it's hard. The reason is that I'm going to break it up is that there are different approaches, and I want you to be flexible. I want you to have the flexibility to take different approaches. But ultimately, it all comes back to it's just a multiplication of two numbers. I'm going to pause now, and I'm going to leave these here. There are others that I want to do. I want to continue finding a certain percent of 400. But before I go on to I'm going to go to some higher percents, continue higher than 10%. But before I do that, I want to show you an alternative approach to doing these. I want you to keep this in mind. Ultimately, we simplified our answer by dividing. There was a division at the end. There won't always be a division at the end to simplify the answer. When we get into some of the ones that aren't nice, that don't work out nicely, these all work out nicely to whole numbers. The answers were whole numbers. The answers will not always be whole numbers when we find a percent of a number. But I want to make sure you fully understand this point. Our last step involved divisions to simplify these improper fractions, right? To do 400 divided by 100 to get 4. But that doesn't change the fact that the problem was a multiplication. All right? That's going to be an important point as we go into the next phase of this video. I left the work and the answer for 1% of 400 up there. We eventually simplified by dividing 400 divided by 100 to get 4. And the way I did all these others was the same in the end, dividing by 100 to simplify. But this percent here, 2%, by definition, it's 2 over 100. But what does it simplify to? What does that fraction simplify to? You should know. It's 1 over 50, right? 2 over 100 simplifies to 1 over 50. So make sure you understand the significance of this. 2% is another name for 1/50th. It's another name for 2 over 100 initially. 2% is 2 over 100, but 100 is 2 times 1 there. 100 is 2 times 50. So we can cancel those 2's and get 1/50th. You should be pretty comfortable with the fact that 2% starts its journey as a fraction, as 2 over 100, but it sort of ends up as 1 over 50 if we simplify. So now, 400 over 1, multiplying across the top and bottom, 400 divided by 50, and that's the same 8 that we got before. To find 2% of a number, you can divide it by 50. See, before when it was 2 over 100, we had 800 over 100. Now this 400 over 50 is equivalent to 800 over 100, but the numbers are smaller. See, this is what I mean by guiding you toward flexibility. And it's going to be up to you. Everyone's going to do it a little differently. Some of you might prefer to just keep it as 2 over 100 and not bother with simplifying. But for those of you who kind of get this, and you know, it might be the way you approach the problem, the way your brain works, you might want to say, okay, 2% of a number divided by 50. Don't divide it by 2. Notice it's still a multiplication. We're still doing 1 over 50, which is 2% times 400 over 1. It's still a multiplication here. It only becomes a division at the end when we simplify. That's a big part of what I'm trying to get across in this particular video. Now, what does 4% simplify to? It begins its fraction life as 4 over 100, but it can be simplified. 4% is 4 over 100, but it's 1 over 25, right? 1 over 25. 4% is 4 over 100, and I'll just do the sort of old-fashioned 4th grade way rather than canceling top and bottom. Divide the top and bottom by 4, 1 over 25, right? So if you want to find 4% of a number, you can divide that number by 25. You're not going to divide it by 4. You're going to multiply it by 4 over 100, which is 1/25. So 4% is 1/25 times 400 over 1 equals 400 over 25. And 400 divided by 25 is asking you what number can I multiply 25 by, excuse me, to get 400? Well, 4 times 25 is 100, right? 4 times 25 is 100. We've got to get up to 400, so we need 4 times 4, or 16, right? 16. Now maybe, you see, here's the flexibility again. Maybe it was easier for you when this was 4 over 100 and you get 1600 over 100. When we did it before, we had 1600 over 100. Maybe that's easier. It's up to you. You choose the path that makes sense for you. I'm going to give you ways to be flexible with this very simple topic of finding a percent of a number. And notice they always begin with multiplications because of the word of. Now 5% is 1/20th. 5 over 100 simplifies to 1/20th. So 1/20th times 400 over 1 equals 400 over 20. And 400 divided by 20, this is easier. It's easier to do 400 divided by 20 to get 20 because 20 times 20 is 400 than it was above. So, you know, sometimes you'll choose a path and you might realize you thought it was a good path, but you might realize, hey, I could have done something different and it would have been easier. You don't always know which is the easy path, which is the hard path, but develop the flexibility so you can work your way through things as you go through math. Now, this is one that I really kind of had this in mind when I developed this lesson. Finding 10% of a number. This is dangerous. This is a dangerous kind of problem because you might get a false idea about things. To find 10% of a number, you do divide by 10. Let's work it through. What is 10% means 10 over 100. What does 10 over 100 simplify to? 10 over 100 is 1/10. 10% equals 10 over 100, which simplifies down to 1/10 if you divide the top bottom by 10. Okay? So I will replace the 10% with 1/10 times 400 over 1. Multiplying across the top bottom, we get 400 over 10, and 400 divided by 10 is, of course, 40. These are the same answers we had before. This one's dangerous because, in general, we do not divide the number over here by this percent number. You only do that with 10%. I'm hoping to make that clear through these examples. And we're going to go further with percents that are greater than 10% and emphasize the same thing. Please understand, these are multiplications. It just so happens that if you decide to use 1/20th for 5%, you end up doing 400 divided by 20 to get the answer over here. As the problem works through, that's what you end up doing at the end. To find 5% of 400, you did not do 400 divided by 5. You ended up doing 400 divided by 20. Okay? So don't be fooled by this one. This is, like I said, it's one that can give you the wrong idea about things. So be careful about that. To find 10% of a number, divide the number by 10. But it only works like that for this one. Okay, let's move on. I've decided to try to squeeze the two ways of answering each of these questions onto the same line without erasing and going through it again. We'll do the two together. Finding a percent of a number is multiplying. Multiplying two numbers together. The percent becomes a fraction. You multiply by the other number. Eventually, often, or sometimes, we can simplify our result by a division, but it is a multiplication. I know I've said that many times, but I have said it many times in the past, and students still want to divide when they're not supposed to, or divide by the wrong number. 20% of 400. Now let's just jump to the second one first. There are many of you right now that know that 20% of a number is the number divided by 5. Raise your hand if you know that. Oh, I can't see. But I bet a lot of you raised your hand. Okay? Well, 400 divided by 5, not divided by 20, you see. Let's do it the long way, using 20 over 100 for 20%, not simplifying the 20%, just writing it as 20 over 100, which is what the definition says. 20% is 20 over 100, times 400 over 1, multiplying across the top and bottom. 20 times 400 is 8,000. 100 here, 8,000 divided by 100 is 80. What does 20 over 100 simplify to? You should know this. You should be very familiar with the factors of 100. By the time you leave 4th grade, certainly, even in 3rd grade, all 4th graders should be very comfortable with 1 times 100, 2 times 50, 4 times 25, 5 times 20, and 10 times 10. That's what I've been doing in this video. I've been taking percents that the percent here is a factor of 100, the 20 in front of the percent sign, the 25. These are factors of 100, which means that when you make a fraction out of these, it's going to reduce to a fraction with 1 in the numerator. 20 over 100 is 1/5. So we have 1/5 of 400. I wrote the word of again. Of and times are the same. Times. Multiply across the top bottom. 1 there. So you get 400 over 5. Finding 1/5 of a number is dividing the number by 5. And 400 divided by 5 is the 80, the same 80 that we got doing 8,000 divided by 100. This is just a simpler version of this. 400 over 5 is an equivalent fraction, simpler because it's got smaller numbers than this one. And eventually they're both 80. All right? 25% of 400. 25 over 100 times 400 over 1. Now, I would suggest that all of you should also be able to instantly multiply 25 by 400. 25 times 4 is 100. Right? 25 times 4 is 100. You got 2 more zeros. 100 followed by 2 zeros. 10,000. Right? 10,000 over 100. Now 10,000 over 100. You got 2 zeros down here, which can knock off 2 of those up there and give you 100. Now, this is probably an excellent example of how, why write 10,000 over 100 or even think it? It's much easier to simplify the 25 over 100. 25 hundredths simplifies to 1/4. 1/4 of 400. Now that's obviously, 1/4 of 400 is obviously 100. The same result as before. All right? Once again, to find 25% of 400, you do not divide 400 by 25. You multiply 400 by 25 over 100 because that's what this is. And you get some big numbers, which eventually you get 100. If you want to take the shortcut, realize that 25% is 1/4. You end up doing 1/4 times 400 over 1. It's 400 over 4, which is a division. 400 divided by 4 is 100. Or you simply think, what's 1/4 of 400? 100. It's 400 divided by 4. Okay? The next one, 50% of 400. I could ask that to probably a second grader, maybe even a first grader. There are certain things about math, middle school math, kids learn it on their own. It's kind of out there. It's out there in, stores have 50% off sales. You talk to your parents. Everybody knows that 50% of 400 is 200. It's half of 400. 50% means 1/2. So if you're going to do a division, you do not do 400 divided by 50. You do 400 divided by 2. Right? Let's look at the long way. 50% is 50 over 100. We are multiplying, finding a percent of a number. Of is multiplied. 400 here over 1. 100 in the denominator, of course. When we don't simplify these percent fractions over here, 20 over, when we don't simplify them, we're going to get 100 in the denominator. 50 times 400 is a 20 with 3 zeros after it. It's 20,000, right? 20 with 3 zeros, 20,000, and 20,000 divided by 100. Well, here's a little technique. Knock off 2 zeros, 2 zeros. There's 200, right? Which we knew it had to be. We knew that 50% of 400 was 200, obviously. But this is nonsense. You're not going to do that. But I keep doing this long way to emphasize multiplication, multiplication, multiplication. They're all multiplications, which eventually can often be simplified with a division. Now this 50 over 100 obviously simplifies to 1/2. 1/2 of 400 is of course 200. We don't really, I don't have to write out 1/2 times 400 over 1. You get 400 over 2, which is 400 divided by 2. You just know half of a number is the number divided by 2, right? And finally, 100% of 400. Well, you may have a sense that, just like you knew that 50% was 1/2, you may have a sense that 100% is the whole thing. So what's the whole 400? 400. The long way, I suppose, would be this. Now this is really, really silly. Extremely silly. 100% is 100 over 100. Times 400 over 1. A 4 with 4 zeros after it. 40,000 over 100. 40,000 divided by 100 is 400. But of course, no one's going to do that. 100 over 100 is 1. 1 times 400 is, of course, 400. To find 10% of a number, 10% of a number, only you do the number divided by 10. Because 10% simplifies down, it's 10 over 100 simplifies down to 1/10. But you don't divide 400 by 20 to find 20% of 400. No. 20% is 1/5. So you actually divide 400 by 5 to get the 80 there. Or you can do it the long way. 26 plus minutes. I usually try to keep these to 30 minutes or less. This, may not be the best way to begin with finding a percent of a number, but, and I've never done it really this way before. What I've done is I've presented you some special cases. Some special cases, the shortcuts. That, for example, to find 25% of a number, you can divide the number by 4, right? That kind of thing. And you already knew that to find 50% of a number, you divide the number by 2, all right? But they begin their lives as multiplications. It's only at the end where a division can simplify. So I think it might be valuable going forward to have these special cases in mind. Because, for example, let me give you one last example before we close this one off, and there will be others. But again, as I said before, it's not because this topic is difficult that it's going to take maybe 2 or 3 videos. It's not because it's difficult, it's because there are different approaches. And the more approaches you are comfortable with, the better for you. 26% of, well, let's just keep the 400. 26% of 400. You're going to be required soon to find that exact number. But can you estimate it? Can you estimate it in 2 seconds, mentally, without writing anything down? This is a little more than 25%. 25% is a fourth. And you should have those relationships of those factors of 100 really mastered well. To know that 25 over 100, which is 25%, simplifies to 1/4. So this is a little more than 1/4. Well, 1/4 of 400 is, of course, 100. It's 400 divided by 4. So we can do this, greater than 100. There's the estimate, right? Whatever 26% of 400 is, it has to be a little more than 100. So I guess this is the reason. This is the reason why I went through these special cases, because they're valuable with estimating and number sense and just getting an idea of what kind of a number do I expect to get. And if you go through 26% of 400 the way I'll teach you later, I really already taught you how to do it now. I mean, you should be able to do it right now. But if you work through this and you get something that's not a little more than 100. By the way, I wrote greater than 100. It's actually just going to be a little more than 100, right? Because the 26% is a little more than 25%, a little more than 1/4. So if you don't get something a little more than 100, you can say, hey, I must have done something wrong, go back and fix it. So we will continue this journey throughout, often throughout 6th grade, here and there. One of the paths that we will follow during 6th grade math will be percents. And of course, the questions will get harder, but we've made that first step. So take care, 6th graders. Finding a percent of a number is easy. It's nothing more than multiplying two numbers together. Bye-bye for now.